In the emerging category, they had to have a few published peer-reviewed studies. In other words, they couldn't just put something out on the internet. They had to be peer-reviewed journals, and they had to have a scientific rating scale of at least 2. So what happens a lot in the emerging category is that maybe most of the evidence is single studies, and so they need more in order to become established, so they land in the emerging category. And they had to have beneficial treatment effects reported for one dependent variable for a specific target. In the emerging category are cognitive behavioral intervention packages, things such as Michelle Winter's or Scott Bellini's work, which we'll talk about. And they're here basically because they're relatively new. We haven't had time to build up a lot of scientific literature. Developmental relation-based strategies are there for the same reason, such as relationship development, intervention, Greenspans. They're not totally new, but we haven't systematically attacked it scientifically. Exercise is in the emerging category and looks very promising, actually, but it lacks large studies. Imitation-based interaction, where you're imitating the child, is here. Surprisingly, language training and understanding are also here. And I think that looking at the studies is primarily here because most language training, language therapy studies are done with a mixed subject group. So not all of the children in these studies had autism, so they could not be included. Massage and touch therapies, relatively new, and so that's in the emerging category. Music therapy is really an up-and-coming area of study, and it's also relatively new, but I think it's probably going to move from the emerging to the established category. They're really doing some good work. Scripting is in the emerging category because it lacks a number of large studies. Sign language is in here, sign instruction, because of the limited generalization outcomes of sign instruction. Social communication intervention, relatively new. Social skills packages, relatively new. They're along the same venue as the cognitive behavioral intervention packages. Structured teaching, such as TEACH, doesn't have a lot of large studies, and that's why it's here. Technology-based treatment, such as using the computer and other types of technology, is relatively new, and that's why it's here. Theory of mind training, there aren't a lot of studies because the initial studies really showed that there was very limited generalization outcome. That yes, in fact, they could learn these little tasks that showed theory of mind, but it didn't generalize to in any functional way. So when we look at things in the not established category, what we know is that they're here maybe because there's research that says they're not established, or maybe because there's not enough research. And certainly we have both of those in this category. So the beneficial treatment effects reported are based on some poorly controlled studies or not enough, and so they have low scores on the scientific merit rating scale. So when we look at a non-established, look at this. Here we are trying to figure out how to teach children with autism, but we don't have a lot of science to guide us in academic interventions. There are very, very few studies in this area. Auditory integration training is also here, and that's because the early research was not positive. So when researchers do several studies and the outcomes are not positive, they stop there. So typically they're not researched out to say, yes, definitively this doesn't work. This is the trend, pretty positive trend in these couple of studies, and so they stop that line of research. Facilitated communication is the same thing, even though these early studies were quite clear that the use of facilitated communication did not always represent the author's thoughts. It wasn't pursued enough to be put in the other category of not effective, it's in not established, because people quit doing research on it. Gluten, casein-free diet, the initial outcomes, again, are not positive, but there were not so many studies because this whole report had a certain amount of criteria that needed to be there. So we know that auditory integration training facilitated communication and gluten, casein-free diet had some pretty strong scientific not positive outcomes, but they didn't have enough to meet the rigor of this particular report. Sensory integration packages, there are just not enough studies to put them anywhere but non-established, because the sensory integration studies that are out there tend to be very poorly designed. To be in the non-effective or harmful category, some of you are probably surprised that some of the things that we talked about earlier aren't in this category. But the reason that they aren't is because researchers rarely continue non-productive lines of research. And so under this project's guidelines, they had to be good studies with a design score of 3 and show no beneficial treatment effects or adverse treatment effects. So there had to be several of those published peer-reviewed studies, more than just 1 or 2, and so even though some of those studies were quite large, there were just only 1 or 2 of them. So we don't have anything in the non-effective or harmful category.